Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us today to discuss a key topic in our Diversity Forum this year, and that is how COVID-19 pandemic has exposed the historic racial disparities in health and healthcare for people of color. I'm Angela Byers-Winston, and I'm delighted to join you today with a wonderful host of colleagues. Our panelists today are literally some of my fellow honorees for the UW Outstanding Women of Color Award, and they all specialize in outreach and delivery of culturally appropriate healthcare and services. Leading our discussion is Dr. Jennifer Edgoose, an associate professor in the Department of Family Medicine and Community Health at the University of Wisconsin-Madison School of Medicine and Public Health. She focuses her attention on the care of vulnerable populations and the strategies to promote health equity and community engagement. Ms. Gina Green-Harris is another panelist, and she is the inaugural director of the Center for Community Engagement and Health Partnerships in Milwaukee. This center was established to further advance research in the African American community in a culturally inclusive way. Our next panelist, Mariela Quesada Centeno, is the director of the Wellness Program at Centro Hispano of Dane County, and she completed her Master's of Public Health here at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Her professional and personal interest is understanding the role of race, gender, and the built environment and how they play in the development of communities of color. And rounding out our illustrious panel is Melissa Matoxin, who is a member of the Oneida Nation of Wisconsin and is the Community and Academic Support Coordinator for the Native American Center for Health Professions, also housed here at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. She forges partnerships with many of Wisconsin's tribal nations to promote community and academic partnerships focused on outreach, retention of Native American students, and to providing health professional students with opportunities to engage with tribal communities across the state. As healthcare experts who are involved in their communities and working every day to improve the quality of life in these communities and to raise the floor across the board for access and quality of healthcare everywhere, our panelists want to focus the perception of disparities to a discussion on how well cultural issues are integrated into the delivery and application of healthcare. So what I'm going to do is start us off with a few questions, and each one of our panelists will begin to engage the topics from their professional lived experiences. And we are excited for you to engage as well, I believe through chats and comments that are happening live. Although we won't be able to see them, you will be able to see them. And we're looking forward to some dialogue and perhaps some feedback from you in the end. So we're going to start now with Dr. Jennifer Edgoose to provide us an overview of the context of COVID-19. I turn it over to Dr. Edgoose.
So thanks, Angela. It's a privilege to be here with this fabulous group of women. So it's obviously been a remarkable year for all of us. It's been incredible to be a family physician in the front lines. So I have had a chance to care for COVID patients both in the hospital and support COVID positive patients in the outpatient setting as well. And even more so than that, I feel like the past 8-9 months have been spent hearing narratives about how COVID-19 is affecting both my colleagues and my patients and their communities. I will just share with you all that my clinical home is the Northeast Clinic, which is on the northeast side of town by the Madison Airport. And we care for a very diverse population, racially, ethnically, and socioeconomically. Our Department of Family Medicine and Community Health cares for people not only throughout Dane County, but across the region. And pre-COVID had, I believe it was 17 family medicine clinics. And we consolidated back in March down to 10. And my clinic, the Northeast Clinic, ended up consolidating with our sister Wingward Clinic on South Park Street. And I will tell you, when that announcement was made, we were all devastated. So it was from our front desk staff to our residents to the faculty, we all realized immediately this would have profound impact upon our most vulnerable patients, many of whom walk to our clinic. So one thing, we actually had a chance to get together as a panel last week, and one of the things we do not want to really spend a lot of time focusing on that we decided collectively are healthcare disparities. So you all can, go on to the Wisconsin DHS Department of Health Services website right now, and you can look up the disparities, and they just upgraded their website last week. And so I will just say very briefly that as of today, you will see that COVID-19 rates are highest amongst our Latinx population across the state. Hospitalizations and deaths are highest amongst our Black population. And it's notable that we are seeing surge of COVID-19 cases amongst our First Nation population here in the state of Wisconsin. And that's really, I think, all the framing that I think I want to focus on right now. I want to call attention that the title of our session is our new health inequities. And just to be clear, when we're talking about inequities, it talks a little bit more than just what health disparities are, which are differences in health outcomes between different populations. We're actually talking about disparities that are caused by systemic, patterned, unnecessary, unjust, and frankly, unfair conditions. These are socially driven conditions. These are actually changeable conditions. So just as a clinician, I just wanted to point out a few things before turning it over to my colleagues. First, that it's really important that when we talk about these health inequities, that you all know, and this is actually not very obvious even amongst the medical community, that race is a social construct. So it is not because our African American community carries a gene from Africa that is causing them to die from higher rates of COVID-19. So you can maybe use President Barack Obama as an example. So he may identify as an African American, but remember his mother was white, his father's from Kenya. And so we should not be applying diagnostic analysis or therapeutics in a way just because he happens to identify as an African American person. The other thing that I think a lot of people think about when they're thinking about quality healthcare is access to healthcare. So another observation I just want to make is that while certainly universal healthcare would be profoundly important and helpful during a pandemic, another issue that has come up over the past 8-9 months is the fact that the medical establishment has suddenly moved into a space of telemedicine, where we are now suddenly finding we are able to diagnose and care for patients by phone and by video. And this is not only happening in the front lines, but this required changes happening at the federal level, the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid, transform policies to enable physicians to bill for these kinds of services. But think about it. So not only are we now dealing with challenges with access to healthcare from an insurance standpoint, we are now asking that our patients have access to the technology and frankly issues like broadband to be able to access the healthcare system. And then finally, it's worth mentioning what are really the drivers of health outcomes. So actually, not only is it the quality of clinical care and access to care, our Population Health Institute, which is home to county health rankings, would say both of those only account for 20% of health outcomes. So everything else is perhaps driven by what we call the social determinants of health. And so this could include things such as having access to good education, to adequate housing, to food, to clean water. All of these things are really what are driving health outcomes. And the other piece that I think is worth mentioning is what some people will call the social determinants of equity. So you also have to consider how power is distributed between communities. So these are things like sexism, classism, ableism, and certainly racism is something that we have to think about. So when we talk about these health inequities that are driven by COVID-19, this is nothing new. So COVID-19 is simply magnifying the already deep and wide disparities along racial and ethnic lines that have pre-existed COVID-19 across our nation, and it certainly profoundly affects the state of Wisconsin. And it's really important to note that the problem are not the marginalized populations. So when we talk about these disturbing numbers, it's really important to think about it's really not the populations that are the problem. It's really structural issues that have long historical record around policies and practices, and a culture, frankly, that has enabled us all to be complicit in the current status quo. So before we sort of feel like, oh, we've got to fix these, the data, we need to really sit on our hands and think about how are we complicit in this, and how can we look upon communities that have been chronically oppressed and look at what assets do they have that we have not opened our eyes to. So thank you.
Dr. Edgoose, thank you for that clinician's perspective on really framing this 80-20 split I want to highlight around the issues of social determinants of health and equity, accounting for 80% of the disparities of what we're seeing in terms of inequities in how and who is being affected by COVID-19. And really that 20% being accounted for by quality of and access to healthcare. I suspect our panelists will start to get into that 80%. And so I want to now opening it up to our panelists and ask each one of you to think about what has been the community response in your communities to COVID, and how has resiliency played a role, specifically in how framing communication around the pandemic is happening in many of the communities that you're serving. And I'd like to start with Ms. Matoxin.
Okay, well, first, thank you for having me today. And as Dr. Edgoose said, it's an honor to be on this panel with these women. I am attending today from my home on the Oneida Nation Reservation near Green Bay, Wisconsin. And I just want to also say that it was really great to see the land acknowledgement that happened at the beginning of this forum this morning. I think that's really important, and I'm happy that our institution is doing that. So in terms of our tribal communities here in Wisconsin, it really varies by community how we've been affected by the pandemic and how the communication has happened around COVID-19. There's definitely been similarities from the communities, but there's also been differences too, because as many of you know, although we're all Native nations of Wisconsin, we're all pretty distinct in our own cultures and communities as well. So I'm going to just talk a little bit about what that looked like in my own community and what I've seen kind of from Oneida. And so I would say, pretty early on, our leadership was aware of COVID-19 and what was kind of happening around the nation and within Wisconsin. And so once we started having some of these numbers and things happen within surrounding communities to Oneida, our leadership took action pretty quickly because we are sovereign nations. And so we're able to kind of make our own public health emergencies and orders around safer at home and things like that. And so in early March, our leadership put out the first public health state of emergency for our community. And so this was a way for our tribal members to understand exactly what was going on and to take this pretty seriously. It's since been extended multiple times, and the most recent extension goes until mid-November. So we're still in that phase, basically. And then on top of that, we also have a COVID-19 response team that consists of some of our leadership, our medical director of our tribal clinic, our public health director, our tribal or our public relations officer, and a few other individuals. And those are the people that are really working every day to ensure that what they're telling our community is accurate, that they're keeping us up to date on everything related to numbers and things like that. And so shortly after the public health emergency was declared, then the COVID-19 response team, they really put forth a safer at home order as well in early March. And that was just so pretty much encouraging all of our tribal members and community members to really just stay home, not engage outside of your own home, and just to really be safe and minimize contact and things like that. So that was something that was really effective. And then one of the other things too that I think is really good to see happening is the use of social media. And so our leadership started doing Facebook Lives 2 times a week. And that is for anybody from our community. We have tribal members that live across the country even as well. So those that aren't even living in Brown and Allegheny counties could still understand and know what was going on in their community. And so that was a way for everyone to kind of hear from leadership. They would answer questions that were typed into the chat, and really just a time for everyone to understand what was going on. And so those are still happening today as well, which is a really great way for us to stay connected, because it's hard. It's a difficult time, and with your loved ones, with your kids, your parents, your grandparents, all of those things. And so everyone wants to understand as much as they can. And so, when it comes to the resiliency piece, I think it's really important because it shows, the communication has always been very upfront. It's been transparent, and it's been a really big urgency for our community to come together. And you see these various campaigns that are happening kind of across the country around masking, and, why do you wear a mask? And a lot of times in some of our tribal communities, you'll hear people saying, I wear a mask for our elders or something like that. And it's a way to really just show the community values that we have in our communities, in terms of just keeping those safe that are most vulnerable, and just protecting our elders. We hold them to a really high level in our communities. And so that's one of the things too that our leadership has always been kind of encouraging. So I think that, just having all of that communication, the different avenues of it, and just being on top of everything with the COVID-19 and how it's affected our communities beyond just, the numbers has been really great.
Thank you, Ms. Matoxin. And I'm really struck by 2 things that you've shared around the notion of collective responsibility to each other's wellness, and the use of technology to keep the community in communication across geographic spaces. Ms. Quesada Centeno, I'd like to hear from your perspective, the communities that you've been working with, what has been the community response to COVID-19, and the ways that resiliency has played a role in framing communication around the pandemic.
Buenas tardes. It's nice to be here. So it's interesting listening to Melissa talk about a little bit more of a cohesive response in her community, which is a place specific in many ways, right? When I think about the Latino community that also incorporates indigenous people from Latin America, our response or experience has been a little bit different. It has not been as concrete, because we are a really heterogeneous community. And Latinos and Latinas represent in the state of Wisconsin the majority of the major proportion of people working in the hospitality, food service, and agricultural fields. So, and these 3 fields or sectors of the economy of this country and the state has been the ones that have been highly impacted from the beginning of the pandemic. So is to put into perspective, I work with hundreds of families since the beginning of the pandemic. and at least 80% of them has lost their jobs. A lot of this data doesn't make it to the media because a lot happens. The Latino community is still really invisible in many ways. We don't talk as much as about the disparities or the inequities that happens within the community beyond healthcare access and healthcare quality, right? So that's one thing. Then the other thing, our families have been really affected by the loss of housing. The majority of our families live in rental units or apartments or mobile homes, which have been resulted for them to have lost their jobs, so they don't have enough money to pay rent. In the beginning of the pandemic, we didn't see as much of that trend because one of the things that could be added to, an example of our resiliency is families will help each other financially, or people will have savings. However, past 2-3 months and 2-3 months without a job, starting July, we start seeing higher rates of Latinos having eviction notices to leave their households. So we are now right now experiencing families that they are in one apartment, 2-3 families in a 2-bedroom apartment. The other one is linguistic literacy and technological literacy. Because our children now are home, many of our families are needed to make the decision of I'm going to have internet connection or I'm going to buy food. Families know that their children need to go to school. So many of them are opting to have internet connection. So we, in many ways, how this pandemic has affected our communities, the Latino communities, are multi-layered. And one of the things that is really interesting is that despite efforts from Latino organization leaders within our community, the support in the system as a whole has not necessarily been there. And that's really worrisome when you think that the Latinos and Latinas are the fastest growing ethnic group in the state, that we provide, we are the backbone of the agricultural economy in this state, that we have the highest reproductive rate in this state. But still, even then, we feel that we need to beg for government or for institutions to provide and to support our families. Like Dr. Edgoose said, Latinos, we are around 6.8% of the population, but we represent, as of from yesterday, 9.6% of the deaths due to COVID-19. That's an inequity in itself, that our families are experiencing the loss of their loved ones while they're experiencing social, economic, and social support losses as well. The other component that is interesting, and that is not often mentioned either, is that we still have a lot of links back to our countries. So we also are carrying the necessity to provide for families back home, not being able to go and see them, having families passing without us being able to say goodbye. So also that stress is really palpable in our families. When you talk about resilience, it's interesting because when I was thinking about that concept a lot in the past week, and how it comes or how it expresses in many ways within our community, and I'm only one Latina, and I do not represent the majority of the continent, so that's in many ways my experience as a recent immigrant, is that we hold a lot on our faith, regardless of which faith that is. But faith, sharing tradition is an important component of what keeps us a little bit more united, and spending time together, even though right now it has been really hard for cultures that personal connection is really important, like some Europeans and some Latin American cultures. So for us, that has been hard, but we have been able to find other ways to maintain that connection. So I guess that in a nutshell, it's important for me to make you understand that despite the fact that data doesn't necessarily show that diversity, that on the beauty and the richness that the Latino community has to offer for the state, we are here. We are here to stay. And it's important that our communities start lifting their voices. We need more voices within the Latino community, within the indigenous community, in our families, to start saying and to start telling their narratives and how they value being here in this state, but also how much they need to be valued by the system or the systems.
Thank you so much. And your comments really highlighted something that I've heard Angela Rye, a well-known political commentator, has said before, that so many of the essential workers identifying as Latinx and Indigenous and Black are seen as essential workers, but their survivability and their well-being is not seen as essential. And so I appreciate you reminding us that sometimes when we think about who is carrying the brunt of COVID-19 impact, is because they've been in service to other people who get to benefit from their sacrifice and their vulnerability. And also, as you highlighted, the resiliency about the importance of still coming together as a community, and in some ways being the answer to the questions and the survivorship that we need. We are the answers for ourselves and what it looks like when we start to look within for our resiliency. So thank you for that. So now I'd like to ask you, Ms. Green-Harris, your comments in terms of the communities that you've been working with, their response to COVID-19, and how resiliency it has been evident in framing a response to the pandemic.
Yes, thank you so much. And thank you for having me as part of this great panel as well. And I just want to be clear, I certainly echo what has been said already. You know, at the start of this pandemic, quite frankly, the Black community was in the forefront because it came out that our community was impacted by COVID the first, all right, and the most, and we couldn't explain really why that was, but it was significant enough so that, quite frankly, the Black community for a long time carried the brunt of the COVID virus. And what I mean by that is that, you know, it was talked about the need to spread 6 feet. It was talked about how we could overcome COVID if some of the practices that were near and dear to our tradition would somehow cease. And we know that that was not necessarily the message that should have been shared, right? Because we knew very little about COVID. And we also know, as has been shared, you know, people of color, particularly Black folks in our community, are those frontline workers too, right? We're in the McDonald's, we're in those care or service organizations, we're those CNAs, we're in all of those spaces that make us frontline workers, and we're being impacted by this virus as well. However, I don't, you know, when we think about what happened in our community, it was more or less, again, looking at things that were culturally important to us to actually describe why this pandemic was really continuing to spread. So for instance, we are really communal people, right? And so the message was spread out, don't socially gather. We use terminology that, quite frankly, impacted our community quite a bit. And so as we were looking at the things that we were doing locally, our community started talking about COVID in another way. We talked about the importance of distancing, but we didn't make it something that was a negative, that our culture appreciated distance, that our culture was actually in fact, very intercommunal. What I mean by that is you and I both know as a culture, we tend to live together, right? We tend to have multi-generations in a home. That's not something that should have been looked at as a negative. And so our community started addressing that, saying, yes, we need to practice safe distancing. We need to practice, if we are in a home, how we can live safely, going in and out, masking, and why that's really critical to our well-being and our health. And I think I heard Melissa talk about why I mask, right? We too put those messages out there, not penalizing, but really encouraging. So that's one thing that I think our community has done well. I think the other thing, particularly in Milwaukee, when we looked at the numbers of death rate in Black Black communities, again, we were trying to figure out what exactly was going on. And I think when we looked at our local leadership, we were not necessarily pleased with what we were seeing in terms of solutions and resolutions. So from a community perspective, our faith leaders began to step up. We began to go back to our hope, which is the church. And we started to see projects put together that were bringing food to families, that were starting to actually start, how do you share masks, and getting people around safe living, and not so much that we were depending on our systems that were in place. I also will highlight one thing that has happened, and this is important because, as Dr. Edgoose talked about, healthcare systems are really critical to our work. And one federally qualified health center in particular that I'm close with, Milwaukee Health Services, actually began, of course, their testing site for our families. They're in the heart of the community, which was really critical because we knew getting Black folks tested was going to be important. And I will tell you that we started out with testing sites in our inner cities, but then they somehow were moved out of locations that were amenable and really helpful for Black families. But we had this healthcare center step up, Milwaukee Health Services in particular, and not only were we doing health testing, but I will add this. One thing that Milwaukee Health Services has done that not only went past specific health care, they actually started doing things to support families. What do I mean by that? The organization actually started having handouts or giving food to families, started making sure they did care packages or PPE packages for family and distributing them, right? And so making sure that we were doing questions to the family about health, wellness, and well-being. What is it as an organization we can do to not only address this COVID, but also support you as you're trying to really continue to live and live well as families? And so that's really important because that was a really important step for a healthcare system to actually step up and see beyond the patient need in that setting, but actually see them and their families as an entity for that community. And so we really salute them for doing that work and continuing to do that work. Now, they, of course, are the largest FQHC that serves African Americans and our brown populations as well. But this was really critical for us because we needed to have an organization that took the family's needs first, as opposed to just looking at the patient or looking at what the data were showing, right? We wanted to really embrace the care of the community and become a part of the fabric work to change. And so that was really important. I think an example of bringing medicine and community, or healthcare and community together to make sure that we were going to have better opportunities in the future. And so I want to bring that to light. I also want to appreciate, of course, the workforce development part of this virus. And how it has impacted us, again, with just workforce needs. We too have, of course, suffered employment loss. Housing has been impacted, and we certainly are concerned as how are we going to move forward if we're not supporting our families to have stable housing and residency. So I know that this has been said already, and I won't continue on, but I just wanted to highlight one win from a healthcare perspective that really is embedded and embodied in the community, that really supports families, because that's really critical to us as we look forward to how are we going to address this pandemic, even in this new high impact season to come.
Thank you, Ms. Green-Harris, for really highlighting that we are people in context, and that context is not just the environment we live in, but the people that we live with. And effective responses, resilient responses include all of that context, the people that we live with and the places that we live in. I also want to just remind us who are watching, we can't see you as participants, but we know you're out there. Please submit your questions, post them. We have colleagues like Crystal Tucker who are taking your questions and putting them in the chat. We'll be talking another 10 or 15 minutes, then we're going to open up. We'd love to have a dialogue with you. So please post your comments, post your questions. We'd love to hear from you. I want to turn a little bit to something that each one of our panelists have already begun to touch on, and that is so many of the communities that are represented by the panelists here have been affected, generally speaking, by colonization, social oppression, and racism that has caused a lot of distrust in the communities. Forced removal from land, forced sterilization, untreated syphilis, harvesting without my consent of my cells. And so you can imagine, we understand why it is hard to trust science for many of the communities. And it's not the science. Actually, this was something that I believe Roland Martin said. It's not that we don't trust the science. We don't trust the scientists. So let me clarify that. So I want to talk a little bit and ask our panelists to really think about, in addition to learning how to offer access to health and healthcare, as Dr. Edgoose mentioned, with dignity and services with sensitivity, how do you go about combining the culture, the history that these communities have experienced in this country with our science? You think about the mistrust about what's happening with the soon-to-come vaccine. We hear the narratives. So I'd love to hear from each one of you. And again, how do you go about combining culture, the history of our communities, with science? I'd like to start with Gina again. Thank you.
Yeah, that's a really interesting question, Dr. Myers-Winston. But you know, it's interesting, and when I think about it, I'm just going to start by saying one of the biggest challenges I think we're facing right now is that, quite frankly, we are in a very peculiar place as a country, and what I mean by that is that there's these schools of thought out there that right now are really hot on the press saying, well, what has America really done to people of color in this country? Haven't we given everyone an opportunity? Don't we, America's already great. And if you just pull up by your bootstraps, right? If you would just obey the laws of the land, you'd be great. As if to suggest that somehow we have not done that, and that we have actually caused these disparities on ourselves, right? We have somehow made this happen to us. And so I think that for me, it's confusing and it's really frustrating when we think about how this picture of Black and Brown America has been painted to make it seem as though we are all violent, that we are lazy, that we have very limited education because we choose to, that we're just this folks wanting a handout, right? And I think that, and I will say that because of some of those beliefs, they perpetuate the disparities that we're all talking about today. And while I will submit to you, I don't believe that's the greater context of the America that we live in. I will honor that. But the unfortunate piece is that there are enough people who have the levers to pull and the control of the systems that we continue to experience these systemic biases and inequities. And so these ideologies, I don't believe, again, are most Americans, but the structural pieces that are in place, we're going to have to address. So to answer your question even more as far as change, or as far as science. So one of the things I just happen to believe, and I am a product of a Black campus. So I'm a product of a HBCU, a historically Black college. And one of the things that we were taught on that college campus was the first point of correction is to teach the truth. The first point of correction in my mind when it comes to science and the scientist is to really educate ourselves or re-educate ourselves that Black scientists have been contributing to the work in this country since its inception. We are the reason for many of the advances in medicine, advances in science that we are experiencing today. And yes, to your point, Dr. Winston Byers, they have been taken from us at some point, but there have been Black scientists who have contributed and made major contributions to the science that we live in today. I think that is really important for us to acknowledge. And it's also important to me that if we're going to address this from a community perspective that our community members who are not Black and brown come to the honest conclusion that, yes, I am not, despite what the media shows, despite what the news feed show, despite those things, white is not the only race of people in this country, nor does that make you automatically an empowered. And I think that is a choice that we have to make. I think part of that question about how do we get past some of the scientific mistrust is to also include people of color, particularly Black and our Latinx community and our Native community, in with the research programs. We need to really start developing research models that are more inclusive at the beginning stages, and also look at using us as citizen scientists, right? Bringing us to the table to be involved, to be engaged. When we do that, we will have dignity. We will have respect because we will be at the table. It will not be needs for focus groups to figure out how to talk about it, because we will be there talking with you about research, about and allowing us to be the experts of our own body and health. That's a novel idea. But we definitely want to make sure that that is something that we are able to practice. And that, to me, will bring equity to this discussion. Over the last 12 years, I will say, as an organization, when we first started our work, we started using asset-based programming, meaning we looked at the resilience and the attributes of the community in which we were serving to identify the strengths with them and pose programs around their needs, their desires, and their goals. And that has been a critical element of getting involvement in research, but trusted scientists to actually be able to not only gather data, but to actually create programs and services that are credible, that are reasonable, and according to the needs of the community. So those things have happened. And then finally, I'll say, with the uprising, quite frankly, over these last several months, one of the things we did do is we set a goal to reframe the narrative of how Black Americans are viewed in this country. And so what we started to do is we've created these monthly dialogues around addressing systemic racism. And those dialogues are webinars that basically were designed specifically to have Black and brown leaders in their fields to come and share their experiences through their lens, and to offer guidance and advice that is practical and palatable and very usable to the community members who consistently say, I don't know what to do. I don't know how I can help. We really want to make sure that we're giving you the tools that you need in order to promote change, right? To exhibit infrastructure change, systemic changes, those things that you have learned, unlearned, because they may not necessarily have been truth. So we are trying our best to really create this new narrative and framework that demonstrates the resilience and the honesty and just the integrity of Black community and brown communities in this country, and to I believe to our added value, that we have value that we have been bringing to this country since its inception. And so I will stop there, but I hope that I've answered your question well. Yes.
Great, thank you. I think you really highlighted the importance of amplifying the voices of those who are doing the science from the lived experience of being Black, Indigenous, and people of color. So thank you for that. Ms. Matoxin, I'd like to hear your response to the question about how you go about combining history and the history and cultures of the communities that you work with and the science.
Yeah, so I mean, this is a great question, because as you mentioned earlier, just all of the hard history that a lot of our communities have had, talking about colonization, obviously, and the people that were in this country before colonization happened. And then, for Native people, the perspective a lot is also including, the oppression, the racism, but also, the forced removal from original lands. And so my tribe, Oneida, is actually originally from the state of New York, and were forcibly removed. And so some of us ended up here in Wisconsin. And so there's just a lot of interesting facts out there. And like Gina mentioned, it's really important to change the narrative, because a lot of times what we're learning about isn't always accurate. And so it's great to see that we are starting to kind of be our own advocates in our communities to make sure that these narratives are being changed and having accurate information shared, whether that's in our educational systems or, other entities. And so when we're talking about kind of combining all of that hard history and then trying to get our communities to embrace this idea of, maybe a vaccine, for COVID-19 or things like that, those are hard things to consider. And there's always going to be a variety of opinions within our communities, for sure, because it's really depends on everyone's own personal experiences too, right? Of how they were brought up or things that they may have experienced. For us in our tribal communities, we are fortunate because most of us have our tribal health clinics. And so here in Oneida, we have, a beautiful clinic. And when you talk about kind of the trust and everything like that, we've had providers that have been in our clinic, some of them for a long time. And so then you're able to kind of build that trust from the community and kind of get something that maybe you don't see, in other areas. So that level of trust is there. But at the same time, I think it's really important to acknowledge that a lot of our Native communities, they really feel more comfortable in getting their care from a provider that's maybe from their own background, because you can understand that they may have experienced some of your experiences. They can understand your history and they have that knowledge. And so I think that's really important to say as well, because that's something that we try to do with NACHIP, is really just encourage our people to go into the health fields, because we want to try to improve the health of our people by having providers who look like us and who are giving that care. So that's really important as well. And so one of the things that we're trying to do is to kind of just have building that trust and making sure, again, the narrative piece is so important, making sure that our communities have the accurate information, especially when it comes to COVID-19, because there's so much information out there and misinformation, really. And a lot of times it's our communities that are receiving that information. And so one thing that we've done, along with two of my colleagues, Dr. Gleason and Dr. Pinzone, is through the help of a Wisconsin Partnership Program grant, is to elevate kind of a community influencer, which is basically somebody from each community. And so we're working with the Latinx community and the African American communities in Madison, and then the Oneida Nation, and having somebody from each of those communities that's utilizing social media, and researchers from SMPH and UW-Madison to get accurate information out there to our communities and ensure that they have the important information that's needed to really keep everybody safe. And so that's been a really great example of something that's helping to kind of build that trust, because if you're receiving information from a trusted source within your community, then you're more than likely to really take that with you. And so it's been great to see that partnership here in Oneida, because the person that was hired works directly with the COVID-19 team. And so it's a partnership that exists. And the tribe supports it as well. And I think that goes back to the piece about, the research piece. And making sure that our communities are involved when there's research projects happening. And we've seen some really great examples of that happening here in Wisconsin on the UW side, and then on the side of the tribes here in the state, where we're making sure that our communities are involved and that the researchers are going about it in the right way. And so kind of serving as a liaison in a way to ensure that if you want access to our communities, you have to go through the proper protocols and channels. You can't have these certain expectations that maybe aren't really the right expectations to have. And so speaking to various people in the community and getting those approvals, especially within our tribal communities, because again, I can't stress enough, we're sovereign nations. We have our own court systems, our own business committees or tribal councils. And so those are the individuals that we have to make sure that we get the approvals from, and everyone is on board, because these are our people. And we want to make sure that any data, anything like that, who owns that then, so there's all these types of questions like that. And so just with COVID-19, it's been really important to kind of bring all those things to light. And I think just the whole movement in general that's happened in the past, year or so around everything. And so it's great to be part of that and just kind of amplify the voices of our communities.
Thank you for your comments. You really highlighted two things that I want to lift up for our audience, and that is that trauma breaks trust. And many of our communities are living the legacies, the intergenerational transmission of traumas that has caused us with all reason to be distrusting of scientists. And dare I say, some of the science that comes out. But another point is that we are more than our trauma. We are not trauma-identified individuals. We have trauma that has passed through our community, but that is not our identity. And that part of moving through the distrust that has happened with many of our communities is rebuilding trust. And trust happens when there's mutual regard, when we feel respected on both ends of that relationship. And so I want to just highlight something that Stephen J. Covey said, that change happens at the speed of trust. And so when we start to think about building science back into our communities that makes sense for us, that we can trust again, it's about relationship building. So I appreciate you highlighting those points, Ms. Matoxin. Ms. Quesada Centeno, I'd love to hear from you in terms of the communities that you're working with and how combining culture and the history of the communities that we've worked with, and the science is coming together for the communities that you serve.
It's interesting. Not everything is black and white. Usually reality is within the gray areas. And specifically for the Latino communities in Wisconsin, we have been here for a long time too. And we have suffered displacement, colonization. Globalization can be called the new colonization era. A lot of the policies that the United States foreign policies have put into our countries are the result of many people migrating to the United States. So we cannot talk about trust and development of relationships within the scientific community and our Latino community and indigenous community without really understanding our historical context and where we come from even before we came to this country. Even many of our ancestors were part of what is now the United States. So, and for me, it's really interesting that still many people here doesn't understand that history. And when you don't understand history, you are deemed to repeat it. And it's currently happening. So that the narrative about trust and distrust within the Latino community about scientists is not necessarily is a little bit different than in the Native communities and the African American communities. Our distrust is mostly with systems, with being seen. Many families are afraid of being counted. Many families are afraid of participating in research. And what that cost is that our real numbers, our real life experiences, our real data is not being properly depicted in research. And because research drives policies, and because policies drive funding, many of our communities are defunded over and over and over. The other component is education. Having the capacity to go through the education process to become a person that is able to generate knowledge. One of the things in our community is the lack of role models. There are some, and they're great. But we are a growing community. We need more of those role models that not only are Mexican or Chicanos or Chicanas, but they also represent the diversity of the Latino experience and the indigenous experience. We need more researchers humble enough to understand what they don't know, and to be able to be honest with themselves when they're doing the IRB protocols, that relationship with that community cannot be the end of all of their research. That they really need to foster that relationship, that it needs to be a horizontal relationship, not a vertical relationship. That the lived experience of those people, those parents or those teens are theirs, and they should be given credit for their stories, for their data. The parachute type of, scheme that many researchers have used in our communities is not valid anymore. It's used, it's old, it's utilitarian. But we also need the research. So is this kind of like, where can we find a sweet spot? We need more researchers that understand our history, our context. We need more researchers within our own communities that have not been colonized within the process of becoming a researcher, but they actually still continue to be part and rooted within the values where they came from. We need communities that are more educated about the importance of their own knowledge, about the importance of participating, of the importance of being seen. Collective power is something that will not happen until these components are all cooked in the same pot. So science is a wonderful thing. It has made us be here despite all the odds. But science by itself will not advance in the speed that it could if not all the people, their knowledge, their experience, their wisdom is also being written. But it needs to be written by them on their language, on the way that they have come to understand the world.
Great. Thank you so much, Ms. Quesada Centeno. I'm excited about the ways that each one of you have shared and highlighted a number of factors that have to be considered when we think about health inequities, as Dr. Edgoose mentioned, not health disparities. From the structural perspective, going back to that 80%, 20% split. So we know that you have been chomping at the bit. For those folk who are watching and joining this panel, we are now going to spend the next 10 minutes of our time together fielding some of your questions, and we thank you for your patience as our media support team are beginning to populate the chat that come from the questions that you have posted. So I'm just going to field a few of them, and I'd like for each one of our panelists to just respond in 60 seconds or less, kind of lightning round, just so that we have a chance to get a few more questions in. So really think about 2 or 3 key sound bites you'd like to respond to, and I'll ask each one of our panelists. So the one question is thinking about teaching practices. What teaching practices can instructors implement in their courses for the rest of the semester to help counter racial, I'll say inequities, although the word is disparities, during COVID-19 and support the learning paths of those most affected? So I'll start with Ms. Matoxin, just 60 seconds, your thoughts of maybe 1 or 2 takeaways for some teaching practices, and then I'll go to Ms. Quesada Centeno and Ms. Green Harris.
Okay, well, immediately what comes to my mind is similar to what was discussed just a little bit ago, and that's just know your history of the communities that are surrounding you, know whose land you're on, and instructors can do a great service by just sharing that information. Land acknowledgements are important, and so something like that can go a long way.
Wonderful. Thank you, Ms. Quesada Centeno.
I will add, be curious, jump in, bring to your syllabus readings that from other authors that you don't know, even from other languages. You may have students that speak other languages, and that will tell a lot to them as well. Get out from the Eiffel Tower that is the university. Go to the community, start doing your own assessments in a really open way, trying to check out your biases, because we all have them, and acknowledge them. But by having curiosity will allow you to gauge, where you're at, and center your students' learning needs and learning interest. When you are developing your curriculum, don't have a curriculum set in stone. Have a curriculum that is capable to morph as you are also learning with your students.
Great. Thank you, Ms. Quesada Centeno. Ms. Green-Harris, and then Dr. Edgoose, I'd love to hear from you as well, since you're literally teaching some of our future family medicine docs.
Yes, sure. You know what I would just add to that is challenge is the data, right? So because a lot of times what we're presenting to students is data, but put the narrative around the data and the context around it. That's what I would say.
Great. Thank you, Dr. Edgoose.
Thanks. I mean, I think just, listening in these spaces is really important. I just got a chance to speak with all these high school students yesterday. And I talked also, just as Ms. Matoxin was saying, about history is as important to learn if you're thinking about going into a health professional field as biology is. I also would challenge that for those of you on campus who would like to explore opportunities to teach, I think now is a great time to really think about something called racial affinity caucusing. I think we put too many of particularly our young people of color who are learners, and expecting them to be teachers. And they've already gone through a whole lifetime's worth of trauma even to be getting to this campus. And so you all can read about racial affinity caucusing, but allowing basically white people to let their hair down and have really hard conversations together is oftentimes a better way to do this sort of exploration without other people of color in the room with them. And people of color sort of need a different space in order to grow and explore in this space. So that would be a suggestion. So thanks.
Excellent. Concrete takeaways, and I hope that the person who posted that is taking notes. Those are fantastic, actionable steps that we can take. I'm going to field two more questions and see if we can get them in before our time wraps up. Another question was that there have been two separate mentions now of both testing and treatment sites being relocated. So could the panelists speak more to how they see local power differentials playing out in terms of geographies of care relative to the communities of color that should be seeing more, not fewer resources coming their way? So again, lightning fast round, just comments about the ways that local power differentials are playing out regarding testing and treatment sites being relocated. I'll start with Ms. Quesada Centeno, then Ms. Matoxin, and Ms. Green-Harris.
I think that in many ways it's funding. Funding to our healthcare departments. And I think that if we all, as citizens and residents of this state, have the right and the duty to demand that our health department is equipped with all the resources that it needs, then testing sites should not be only in neighborhoods that are safer. It should be everywhere. I always think that should be in every quick trip. There should be a testing site. So, and I think that it just by talking with a healthcare provider, by talking by a healthcare people who is elected, to office, and say we need more. We need more. And again, the power of numbers, the power of demanding that. It's not possible that the Alliance Center and the Energy Center is one of the biggest sites in Madison. When lines of people gather, that it creates its own challenges. So I think that in terms of the Latino community, we have been able to move to have some testing sites in neighborhoods that are more Latino residents, but we need more of these in all neighborhoods.
Okay, Ms. Matoxin or Ms. Green-Harris?
I would definitely agree with all that, and just advocacy, accessibility, advocacy within our health systems, really, which is why we need more providers of color serving in these various roles, because we need people at all different levels advocating for what our communities need. It's great to see people like Dr. Edgoose doing that hard work and really being a voice for various populations. And so I would say those are the two biggest things for me.
Thank you, Ms. Green-Harris.
Absolutely. So I would echo everything that was said. I certainly think that, looking at the advocacy from around our communities, definitely needing to have those voices at some of our, even our elected places. So our political will is really important in this too, and really getting to our locally elected officials and demanding that those sites remain is really going to be important for the work moving forward. So I think I echo everything else and add that. Thank you.
You actually teed up the next question, so thank you for that handoff. And I think we have time to get this one last question in under the wire, and that is the matter of the lack of leadership at the federal level and how that's impacted all of us. And so the question is, would a stronger science-based response combined with federal dollars be able to help and change these issues for Black, Indigenous, people of color communities, or do we need a response that's more local? So I want to start with you, Ms. Green-Harris, because you teed us up, and then go to Ms. Melissa Matoxin, and we'll wrap up with Ms. Quesada Centeno. Thank you.
Thank you. So I absolutely agree that that is important. And I do think, yes, we definitely need some federal leadership. We need scientific leadership, but I would embrace the thought around making sure that they're representative of the communities that we're talking about being most impacted. So it goes back to the initial part of our conversation about full inclusion around diverse people and having reflection or representation. And definitely at the local level, we certainly need to do more, and we need to, again, address our elected officials locally and have the advocates expressing what those needs are. So I would definitely agree with that question. I'm in 60 seconds. I'm working on that.
Thank you. Ms. Matoxin.
I think with the elected officials, with our tribal communities, we're able to vote in our own elected officials. And so those are individuals that we are able to know that are vying for our communities and kind of lobbying and talking with at the federal level with leadership and things, and then bringing some of those things back locally. So definitely, I think it needs to be a partnership. Everything needs to be a partnership on all levels, and ideally, yes, federal dollars. Some of our communities received COVID relief funds, which was a great help. And, can't say that enough. And all of our communities need to be getting those funds.
Excellent. Thank you, Ms. Quesada Centeno.
So I think that, in terms of the Latino community, we don't have enough elected officials representing that amount of people that is in the state or the country that are Latinos or Latinas. So we are lacking in there. So there's more voices need to be there, more support to people that will run to office. But one thing that is important to think about is that COVID-19 didn't cause these all things that we're going through, this, the horrors that many of our families are facing. This has been here for generations. The inequalities, the lack of the society to understand that people, regardless of their color or their skin, are people. So yes, the lack of leadership in this particular administration, but we had many administrations before this one. So, and it's important to recognize that, because at the end of the tunnel, when whatever we're going to come out of the tunnel, the light, our white counterparts probably will still be better off than communities of color, because we didn't start this race with the same capacities. I'm not saying intellectual capacities or physical capacities. I'm saying societal capacities and financial capacities and generational wealth. So the race right now, from now moving forward, is for everybody to realize that we are all interconnected, that your well-being is my well-being. If I get sick, I can infect you. So we should treat social inequalities as a contagious disease, because it is. And doesn't matter how much we contain it, it will never be able to be contained, because our lives are intertwined. My economy is intertwined with yours. And elected officials have a role, and there's a really important role, and funding has a role. But for example, for many undocumented immigrants, they do pay the taxes and they don't receive federal stimulus money. What is that saying to them, to their children that are U.S. citizens? So the conversation has to be expanded beyond COVID, because COVID is just a magnifying glass. The reality that lies underneath it is what we'll need to deal with.
That's a fantastic way to wrap up our time together today. It's really reminding ourselves that we are all in this together. This thriving together component really highlights the importance of the ethic of care, something that Dr. Cornel West talked about in his classic book, Race Matters, decades ago, that in order to change the structural inequities that have long been sustaining the disparities that we see in our communities, Black, Indigenous, and people of color communities, we have to care, which means we have to restore the humanity and dignity through which we view one another. So I want to thank each one of you on behalf of the many people who are watching and joined us. We wish we could see you as well on Zoom, but we thank you for your time. I thank each one of my colleagues that I'm privileged to say I know and learn from on a daily basis. And thank you for taking a moment to share your wisdom, your science, your lived perspective and insights to this panel. Again, we thank the Diversity Forum for the opportunity to have this panel and wish everybody a fantastic day.